Hello, insiders, and welcome to episode 11 of the Inside Job with Philip Cox podcast. And when you're doing these podcasts, you begin to hear these industry trade secrets. And one of the things that you hear and that I've heard recently is you need to keep all of your episodes evergreen. And I was like, well, what does evergreen mean? And so I found out that evergreen means you don't want to tell people what time of year it is, what time of day, anything like that, because you want people to hear it as if at any point in the year, and it doesn't make any difference. And so you just keep it evergreen. You don't give any specifics about when it's being recorded. But all evergreen makes me think of is the fact that it is Christmas season right now because it's the 10th of December in 2024. So I will not keep this evergreen because evergreen only makes me think of the greatest season of all, which is the Christmas season. And we are having such an amazing time as a family, just loving time together. We're actually spending tons of time watching Christmas movies and playing games together, and the kids are in the last throes. They're in the dregs of their final. School's ended, but they're in this last week because Susan and I work, and so they're having to go to school even though school's not really on, and they're helping their teachers clean their classrooms, which is really funny to me and not so funny to them. But once they get home, we are having a blast and enjoying. We love Christmas music, and we love all the trappings of Christmas. And so this is a not evergreen podcast. This show has nothing to do, this episode has nothing to do with Christmas specifically, but I just that evergreen notion I thought was funny. So there you go. No, today we are continuing in our Earth and Skies series, and this is just hey, you know what? You guys don't get to see behind the scenes, but these Substack posts are going gangbusters, and so I'm quite excited. So if you're out there sharing the love, keep doing it because it's fantastic. So we're getting lots of people reading and engaging, and it's so much fun. And so if these are meaning something to you, then please feel free to share them with your friends. But today, in the Earth and Sky series, we are exploring another one of these Hebrew words that shows up in Genesis 1. Obviously, it shows up other places in Scripture, but we are looking at how it's working in Genesis 1 inside of this poetic narrative of creation. And we are looking at the word kah-RAH. kah-RAH. And I'm phonetically spelling all of these words as the title of these posts. So whenever you see a really strange looking word, you know it's where you're in the Earth and Sky series again. And so we're going to jump right in to this post called kah-RAH. I spent a good deal of my 20s working in Nashville, Tennessee as a touring drummer. And while I had a blast jaunting to and fro across the globe, as many professional artists can tell you, a solid paycheck is not one of the perks of the gig-to-gig lifestyle. And quite often I'd arrive home from a tour and my mailbox would be overflowing with bills. It would be overflowing with mail, but particularly it'd be overflowing with bills. It would be a cornucopia of sadness, splaying its bounty across my front yard. So, tapping into all the wisdom and the financial astuteness that you pick up sitting in dimly lit green rooms and tour buses, I'd take these stacks of bills, I would shove them in a drawer, and I would just simply go on about my day. Somehow, I'd convinced myself that as long as I didn't open the envelopes or actually look at the amounts, somehow that these bills didn't really exist. So I stuffed them in a drawer and pretended that all my financial problems were gone and I'd never have to think about them again. Now, as insane as that sounds, I have a feeling that this phenomenon, the thing that's sitting underneath this craziness, isn't just exclusive to only 20-somethings Phil. And as I've been working on this Earth and Sky series, this crazy memory keeps coming back to mind over and over again in connection with our next word from this story of creation in Genesis 1. And that is the Hebrew verb kah-RAH. Now, kah-RAH means to name or to call. Kah-RAH appears in the story after God separates the light from the dark. The poem says that the Creator names or calls, he kah-RAHs the light day, and he kah-RAHs the darkness night. And then this divine cosmic artist goes on to name the skies and the ground and the waters. Now, in many ancient cultures, the act of naming held profound significance. In Hebrew, to kah-RAH was far more significant than just slapping on a label. Like we saw with ruach, and if you haven't heard or read that post, you can go back to ruach. Like we saw with ruach, there are also multiple interpretive layers, wisdom layers to this ancient word kah-RAH. Because kah-RAH doesn't only mean to call or to name, but the deeper thing here is that it's also translated to summon. This is fascinating and profound, and I want to explore a bit and show you why I say how profound that this summoning thing, this kah-RAHing is. So last Christmas, so we're no longer in the evergreen. Last Christmas, Susan and I surprised the kids. We gave them a brand new puppy, and that, if you've never given a child a puppy for Christmas, and especially if you put it in a bag that says "Sorry, it's not a puppy" written on the bag, if you've never done that, may I suggest go out and get a puppy just to do that. Go out and get a few kids just to do that. Go to a nephew or a niece. Go find somebody on the street and say, "Can I give you a puppy?" And you give them a puppy in a bag. It'll be the greatest joy you ever see on a child's face. So last Christmas, Susan and I decided to surprise the kids with a brand new puppy. And then, as a family, we sat together and we decided, of course, we have to come up with a name. What are we going to name this puppy? And so eventually we landed on the name Pepper. And that was completely my suggestion, by the way. Good to get that one in. Pepper. Well, we have a horse, and the horse is named Saffron. And so we thought we'd stay in the spice family, So we have Saffron and Pepper. So we named her Pepper. Now, in one sense, when we named her, there was nothing new that was brought into existence. No new atoms were formed. None of these atoms, none of them were created or created to bond together to form new molecules. And those molecules didn't collaborate to form any new cells or tissues or bones. So nothing new was created. And yet, in another sense, something new did emerge. Because when we named her, she went from just being some dog over there to becoming Pepper. Pepper, a new and beloved member of our family. This is because there's something about the naming that's deeper and more meaningful and more profound than just giving a title. When we spoke out the name Pepper, it was as if we spoke truth and life to the vague and the unrealized, and pulled, or that word, that summoning, we pulled or summoned her, Pepper, into reality. Our act of naming took the general, the vague, and the undefined and brought it into being by creating distinction. That's what's happening in naming. It takes the undefined and it creates distinction. Now, contrary to popular thought and popular ways that this story is read, this creation story isn't about God creating something out of nothing. This is what's often called creatio ex nihilo, which is Latin for creation from nothing. So while I'm sure that the original audience, if they were asked, if you said, now where did all this stuff come from? They would say that God also made all the pre-cosmos stuff, they would say, yes, that God made that, all that tohu vavohu. You remember all the tohu vavohu, the wild and watery, the pre-cosmic waters, that wild and watery wasteland. If you ask an ancient hearer of the story, well, who created all that? I'm sure that they would have said, yes, God also created that. But the point is, that's not what's happening in this story. In this Genesis 1, it's not saying who created all the original material, because there was original material there. Tohu vavohu, that's what the original material was. God, in this story of creation, is working with that pre-existing material, which is unordered, unproductive, and a wasteland, and he's bringing it into function, into being by naming it, not by creating it from nothing, not ex nihilo, which is the common way it's taught. So instead, the creator in this incredible poem summons the cosmos out of the messiness, the chaotic state of an unproductive landscape. Again, tohu vavohu. And he does so by clarifying, by organizing, and by making distinctions, by naming. Now, and if you're interested in the scholarly stuff behind what I'm saying here, because I'm not just giving you my opinion, but you can look at the best scholars in this field, and that's where that's all my research is in these scholars from this ancient Near Eastern perspective, and you can go and look at the Substack post, and in the footnotes I've got lots of references, and you can take a look at those there. But it goes deeper. It's not just this ordering and making distinction. Light, dark, water, earth, stars, planets, humans, etc. They aren't just named and given distinction. Naming also gives them a function. In naming something, it didn't just give it a label, it gave it a function. It said what it was there for. Their purposes, their meanings, their roles are laid out for them in their naming. And you can see that happening in verses 14 through 19 of that Genesis 1 story. This ancient Hebrew word kah-RAH, it also holds meaning. This is fascinating. It also holds meaning for the person or the spiritual being that's doing the naming. So across the ancient Near East, you would also find lots of other stories that when the pantheon of gods, when they would whoever named something or whatever their name was, it meant that they had responsibility over what they had named or what their name was. So whether it was agriculture or weather or reproduction, their name was connected to what they were had rule and say over, or they would be the ones to name what they had rule and say over. And so to name something meant to take ownership and responsibility for what was named. And we can see this concept at work in the second Hebrew creation story. Yes, there are two. There actually are multiple ones, and I've got those laid out in the footnotes too. But on the second Hebrew creation story found in Scripture in Genesis, and that's in Genesis 2, separate creation story, separate tradition that have been brought together in this text. They work together, they cooperate with one another, but they are two distinct tellings of creation. And that's not a problem for these Hebrew authors. They're not lazy thinkers. They're doing other things here. They're doing wisdom. Again, this is wisdom literature, not a scientific textbook. So it's fine to have these two traditions sitting next to each other because they're doing something different. So we see this naming concept of work, this ownership, this responsibility. We see that concept at work in the second Hebrew creation story found in Scripture when the animals are brought to Adam to be named. Do you remember that? When God comes and he brings all the animals and he brings them before Adam to be named, handing this job of naming to, now we say Adam, but in Hebrew it's Adam. And Adam it can be a proper name, but what it actually means, the word Adam means humanity. That's all it means, humanity. So this job of naming was handed to Adam. It's not because the creator had suddenly had a writer's block or something like that. This act of trust, this was an act of trust from God, and he places the animals under the protective care and responsibility of Adam, the responsibility of humanity. He says, humanity, you are to care for and be responsible and take ownership of these creatures. Now, you could probably say we may have run off the rails with that one. Yeah, you can think through that one on your own. But I won't say any more about that. But we are brought in this story, this wisdom story, we are brought these animals to name so that we have responsibility to care for and steward over them. This ancient view sees naming as a way of taking the ethereal and making it concrete. That's what naming does. It takes this conceptual, what sits out there in the ether, and it grounds it in the concrete, grounding the conceptual, grounding the abstract in lived reality. In essence, kah-RAH isn't just what we often think of as naming. Instead, to summarize, kah-RAH calls into being, kah-RAH gives clarity, kah-RAH brings with it a level of ownership and a level of responsibility. That's the power of naming in the ancient Near East and in the ancient world and in the world of Scripture, the world of the Hebrew Scriptures. But as always, we're not just here doing scholarship. We are here sitting here asking, as fascinating as scholarship is, and we can have many hours of conversation if you want about that. But as always, we need to ask, so what? So what? How does any of this ancient stuff matter to us today? Well, as it turns out, these super old folks had some wisdom in their bones after all. And I say after all as sarcastically, because of course they did. Of course they did. But I just listened to a debate. I'm not a fan of debates at all. It wasn't even a debate. It was more of a conversation. It was a good conversation, but it was a conversation with Richard Dawkins, a brilliant scientist, brilliant thinker, and yet he does not have it seems he doesn't have the capacity in his way of thinking, in the filters through which he lives his life. It doesn't seem that he has the ability to even fathom that these texts could have been written by anyone that was a genius literarily, or that these were artists crafting. He just sees these as nomadic people, very primitive in their thinking, writing down dumb stories that have nothing to do with reality. And that's just fundamentally the wrong category for what this stuff is. And so these old folks, of course they had wisdom. Of course they did. This naming stuff, it actually has real practical outworkings for us today. It seems that for some people like me, there is this real sense that if we don't acknowledge or name something, that it kind of isn't real, that it won't really affect us. It's kind of like, it's like an avoidance pattern. We might distract ourselves with the good old Netflix binge or ghost a friend because of that really awkward thing that Darcy said at the party the other night, and we don't want to deal with that, so we'll just kind of let that play out, and we'll talk to them later, but for now we're not going to text them back. Or we realize that subconsciously we've been taking a longer route to work because we don't want to drive past that person's house anymore, and so we decide to avoid that road. Maybe we notice something weird is in the air between us, the space between us and a friend that we're sitting across from. We notice that something's changed in that space between us. But instead of addressing it and kind of bringing it up and saying, what's going on here? What's changed? Instead, we just change the topic, and we to keep the peace. So we kind of bring that relationship out of the depth and of vulnerability and honesty, and we pull it up to the surface and just kind of, just keep the conversation going and keep everything at bay. And there are entire personality structures that are built around this avoidance pattern of not naming, not giving voice to our inner world, the inner cosmos of emotions, which is so complex and so fascinating, but can be so gripping and so terrifying when we haven't traversed that terrain. And so there can be entire personality structures built around keeping us from ever having to like deal with those kinds of things. So we just keep. There's a difference between keeping the peace and making peace. Peacekeepers and peacemakers are two different things. Blessed are the peacemakers. Peacekeeping can be a different beast. But this is what we mean when we use the phrase, "Oh, hey, well, we're sweeping it. They're just sweeping it under the rug. There's an issue there, but just sweep it under the rug." That's what's underneath this naming thing. That's what's underneath that phrase, that popular phrase. All of our creative and at times really brilliant distractions and coping mechanisms become a multitude of ways to not name the things that we feel like we're unprepared for or that we're too afraid to face. It was the life of financial responsibility that me, as a 20-year-old drummer, was desperate to avoid. I couldn't deal with that level of grown-up reality, those kind of financial responsibilities that as a 20-year-old. And I just wanted to avoid them. My cornucopia of sadness mailbox represented a reality that my egoic ideals of what it meant to be a professional musician couldn't face. And so my desk drawer provided the solution to that problem, a solution to that unanswered ideal. But of course, as all egoic agendas are, it was unfruitful. It didn't bring me to what I actually needed, what I actually wanted. So ultimately, my solution, which I put in quotes, the solution that my desk drawer provided came back to haunt me. Of course it did, because guess what? When you pick a fight against reality, reality wins every time. Don't pick fights against reality. Come to face reality. Come to accept reality. Come to see reality as a gift. And yes, if there's a sting in it, there's a sting in it. And it's come to be a teacher. We've talked about this many times. Reality is giving us what it is, and it's offering us the opportunity to engage with it honestly. And when we don't engage with it honestly, it comes back to bite us and causes so much extra suffering that's not needed. Don't pick fights against reality. Reality will win every time. Maybe you've known somebody, or maybe you know somebody right now. Maybe you are this somebody, and you know that something is going on inside of your body, and it's not right. Something in there is not right. But you refuse, or they refuse, to go to the doctor for fear of what the diagnosis might be. It's like they know deep down that once they hear the bad news, well, now I've heard it. It's been diagnosed. Now I'm going to have to do something about it. But as long as it stays unnamed, okay, I don't have to actually do anything about it. Having the information, having the diagnosis, and then having a treatment plan, it would make it too real for them. Make it too real for you, maybe. And so as long as it doesn't get named, somehow it doesn't really exist. Naming, though, the gift of naming can provide the clarity that becomes helpful in finally moving out of the tohu vavohu inside of our life, the tohu vavohu of unknowns. And if you remember from the tohu vavohu post, that was just the chaotic, messy, undistinguished landscape. That's what tohu vavohu is. So naming brings clarity that becomes helpful in moving out of that chaos, moving out of that tohu vavohu of unknowns, and gives us a path forward into our future, whatever that looks like. Whatever. And naming isn't a one-stop shop. It's not a silver bullet, but it helps us bring clarity for what is the next step when I begin to name. It gives us a path forward, whatever that path looks like and whatever that step looks like. Even if it doesn't seem good to us or right to us right now, naming helps us come to terms with what is, come to terms with reality, and then helps us know what our next step should be. You know, one of the most powerful moments for anyone who's in recovery or has been through recovery will tell you that in one of these 12-step programs happens before you ever even get to step 1 of the 12 steps. And it happens in the act of showing up and owning the truth and naming why you're there. You come, you sit in a circle, and you say, "Hi, my name is Phil, and I am whatever you're there for." That's before you even get to step 1. You simply sit there and you say, "This is who I am, and this is what's true of me." And while it doesn't encompass the full journey towards healing and restoration, it doesn't do everything. Naming gets the ball rolling. And now, I don't know if you've seen the Disney movie Encanto or not, but when that movie came out, our kids were at the perfect age to keep it on repeat for a while. Well, there's a character named Bruno and a song about Bruno in that movie that is a perfect demonstration of both the shadowy side and the healing side that can come on this act of naming. Because Bruno is a part, if you've seen it or not, Bruno's a part of this really magical family. And Bruno's gift inside of this family is he has the gift of seeing the future. However, Bruno's mother, who's like the matriarch of the family, the grandmother figure, she has come to believe that his gift will ultimately bring bad luck onto the family. So she convinces the whole family that they need to shun Bruno. Well, Bruno ends up being afraid of his gift as well, and so he exiles himself away from the family to keep them safe, although in reality he hides inside of the walls of this massive family home that they have, and actually sits on the other side of the wall of their dinner. When they're having dinner, he's on the other side of the wall, but they have no idea he's there, but they can kind of feel his presence, but he's not there. And his mother refuses to let anyone speak about Bruno's absence. And so this ban from speaking about Bruno ends up dominating the entire household. What isn't said ends up impacting every conversation. The sound of this silence is deafening. Did you know silence has a sound? The sound of silence can be deafening, and it reverberates through the entire family in what has become their family anthem. And it's this really popular, really fun song to sing along to that says, "We don't talk about Bruno." But when the main character, Mirabelle, which is Bruno's niece, when she finds him and realizes the actual truth of this whole thing, she helps the family face their fears. She helps them reconcile with Bruno. Her act of naming, they wouldn't name, but her act of naming transforms the family's obsessive avoidance and turns it into this celebration of healing and acceptance. And so you see the dark side of refusing to name and the tragedy and heartbreak and relationship tearing that it causes, and then the healing act of naming and the healing that it brings to these avoidance patterns, and it brings acceptance and healing, all these things. So this powerful story from our good buddies over at Disney perfectly illustrates this ancient word, kah-RAH. It reminds us that it's not until issues are named that we can take ownership of them and begin moving towards greater purpose and freedom and healing, reconciliation, transformation, and ultimately it restores joy. Ultimately, maybe not initially, but ultimately, it opens up the opportunity for joy to take the place of brokenness and sadness and all that. So, to wrap this up, we've covered a lot of ground, and I appreciate you hanging in there with me on this one. This one's actually a really big deal for me, and I've actually personally seen the power of this practice of naming for many years, way after the old mailbox mess was cleared away. But because there's always a good bit of info dumping in some of these posts and some of these podcasts, I thought I'd offer a few quick takeaways on this one. And I should probably do this for all of them, but maybe I will from here on out. But a few quick takeaways. Number one, kah-RAH. It concretizes the abstract It makes the abstract concrete. Kah-RAH concretizes the abstract. So maybe you feel like you're emotionally scattered, and you feel like your body, your heart, and your mind, they feel a bit like that chaotic tohu vavohu. And so what if these muddy and these hazy feelings, what if they could begin to find some shape and find some clarity if you could begin to properly name those feelings? Now, I don't know if you've heard of the emotion wheel, the wheel of emotion or the emotion wheel. There's quite a few out there, and all you have to do is Google the emotion wheel, and you'll see all types. But Dr. Robert Plutchik's is, I think it's the original, and it's great. But then Brene Brown has done a bit of work on hers as well. She talks about, in Atlas of the Heart, Brene Brown talks about emotional granularity. In other words, she says basically there's only about 3 main emotions that any human being can experience, or that a lot of human beings experience at any given level. And it's to feel angry, to feel sad, or to feel happy. And really, if you ask them to go in more detail, more depth, there's a lot of people who can only kind of really give voice to those 3 primary emotions. Well, in her book, Atlas of the Heart, she offers 87 emotional granularity. She pulls them apart, and she makes them way more granular. She separates them into 87 common emotions that define what it means to be human. And there's, again, just Google the emotion wheel, and you're going to find tons of versions out there. But look at Robert Plutchik's emotion wheel or Brene Brown's Atlas of the Heart and her 87 types of emotions. And I bring that up to say, if you're feeling those emotions and you can't quite, it feels fuzzy and it feels hazy, maybe you could begin to name some of those to give them a bit more shape and clarity. And you could go from just saying, I feel sad. And you go, oh, I don't just feel sad. I feel neglected. I feel unseen. I feel lonely. I feel lost. And as soon as you begin to give some of those emotions greater clarity, emotional granularity, all of a sudden it comes into clearer view. And then the clearer it becomes, we can begin to know. Remember, it gives us a path forward. I feel lonely. Okay, well, that's a different thing than just feeling sad. When I just say I feel sad, I don't have a whole lot of places I can go with that necessarily. But if I say I feel lonely, I feel lost, well, now I can begin to make steps towards working with that emotion. This is true in relationships, of course, as well. There's a space that exists between people, and when things go unnamed for too long, we don't have to run around naming every single thing that we ever feel. You know, you can take this stuff way too far. But when things go unnamed, when big things go unnamed for too long, sometimes you need to name something for yourself, and sometimes you need to name it to the other person. So those are 2 separate things too. But if something goes unnamed for too long, it begins to disrupt that space between us and the other person. And we often respond to this disruption by putting up walls, by creating distance, and that paves the way for bitterness and resentment and unforgiveness to set in just because we haven't named something. We haven't sat down and said, I need to talk to you about something. I need to talk to you about how I'm feeling. Now, again, you can go way out on a limb on that, so we're not going to do that. But this is about naming those big things. Trauma experts say that without naming a chaotic event, that's what actually trauma is not being able to give a meaningful narrative to an event can cause trauma because we don't have a shelf for it. We don't know where that fits. And because our brain doesn't have a story, a meaningful narrative it can attach to an event, it can cause trauma. So trauma experts say that without naming a chaotic event, we risk re-traumatization and a cycle, and building in this cycle of negative expectations that end up kind of being these self-fulfilling prophecies that we have about ourselves and have about the world. So naming these experiences begins the process of detangling the complexities of the event. And it can begin to bring us to a place of order and peace and acceptance. And I've got a couple of really good references there in the post about that one in particular. So I said this was going to be quick. I don't do anything quick as it turns out. Number 1, kah-RAH concretizes the abstract. Number 2, kah-RAH defines. It brings distinction and clarity. Maybe you own a business. Maybe you run a team. Maybe you are a part of a community or a project and a company. Are there people in that group that regularly, like a pattern, don't meet the needs of the whole, don't meet the expectations that you've set out for them? Or maybe they're not meeting expectations because actually their role hasn't been properly defined. You haven't actually laid out what your expectations are of them. You've expected them to just kind of know automatically what they're supposed to do, but that rarely happens that somebody can kind of read our brain. We need to be able to name to them, hey, this is your job. This is your job. Is there anything better than a great job description that says this is exactly what we expect? These are our time frames. These are the metrics. These are all those things. Maybe your project isn't on task, isn't staying on task. Maybe your company isn't doing so well. Maybe the team you're leading isn't doing so well because they have things that haven't been named well enough for them, haven't been defined. You haven't brought distinction to their role. You haven't brought clarity to your expectations. So think about that next time you're in a team meeting or building out a job description. kah-RAH concretizes the abstract. kah-RAH defines. It brings clarity and distinction. And finally, kah-RAH has the power to summon. Now, it is worth noting that we are not just talking about the negative and the traumatic things that need to be named. Of course, those things need to be named. Maybe even more so, those things need to be named. But this summoning power also asks the questions, what if there are real gifts inside of us? What if there are real possibilities and real imaginations and real creative endeavors that have been lying dormant for years? Maybe they've been sidelined by the busyness of life and parenting and all those things, and they're just sitting there dormant, and they're waiting to be spoken to and divinely breathed upon and summoned back into reality. Maybe it's time to begin speaking about those old passions again and seeing where those conversations with yourself, with God, and with others take you. And you know what? This is actually the beginning practice of prayer. Prayer is just naming your interiors. Prayer is taking all those feelings and complexities and not just dealing with them yourself. Of course, we have therapists and we have friends and we have all those things. But this is the beginning practice of prayer. And sometimes naming those negative things, that's the beginning practice of lament. Lament is this great power of saying, God, something in this great big cosmos is out of order. And I'm really frustrated about that. And I need you to come and do something about that, about this chaos that I'm feeling. That's the power of lament. Lament is naming to God that something is out of order, that my life has turned from tov, which is the Hebrew word for good, has gone from tov to tohu vavohu. It's gone from good to chaotic again. And we have to lament those things. We name our inner world. That's the beginning of prayer, to name our insides and bring them out so that something can happen with them. So, what is something in your life, your work, your relationships, your inner world of feelings that needs to be named? And could you begin to find the courage? Because it does take courage. It does take courage. Could you begin to find the courage to have those difficult conversations with yourself? And so start with yourself maybe. Hey, This is how I'm feeling. These are the things I'm frustrated with. These are the things I'm hoping for. And begin to speak to yourself about these things. Have the courage to have these difficult conversations with yourself. I need to go see my doctor. I need to go see my doctor. I'm going to do that. Have those difficult conversations with God, with a therapist. Find a spiritual director. Find a wise friend, someone you know you can trust, someone who's not going to immediately try to fix you or judge you or any of those things. A wise friend. This practice, when used well, when entered with wisdom, can truly be the gateway for profound breakthroughs in our life, for profound healing and bringing peace to storms. Even if the storm rages, it brings us to peace inside of it, to help find new beginnings in our life, in our work, our creative projects, in our relationships, to find new beginnings. And that's just getting started. There's so much more to this profound act of naming. And there's going to be more to come in this series, of course, but that's plenty for now. And so, I've got this little, before we fully wrap on this, I've got this very short afterthought, and I think it's important to say this. Naming is obviously this really powerful force. It's a powerful force. It's a creative, powerful force. It's really the wisdom behind manifestation. You hear people talking about manifestation out there. Well, it goes off the rails with some things and gets kind of crazy and weird. But that's what's going on behind that. It's like the things that you speak, you have the ability to create things with your speech. It's a powerful force. It's one that's powerful enough to create a world, as we see in Genesis 1. Powerful to create a reality in our minds, in our emotions, in our relationships through defining and clarifying. However, this powerful practice has a shadow side. We saw it with that Bruno story. It does have a shadow side. But so we're going to name that shadow side really quickly. While naming holds the power to clarify and define, it can also be misused, particularly when it's used to label or limit others. We do not need to name for others. We need to name for ourselves. When we name others, especially their experiences, their identities, or their struggles, we risk reducing them to our single narrative or to a single narrative that may not be true about their full humanity. This is why we don't judge other people. Judging someone else is or gossiping about someone else is saying this is what's true of them for now and forever. That's the darkness behind gossip. Is we're naming something for someone else. Because we're assigning not only what they're doing, we're usually assigning a motive for why they're doing it, which we can't possibly know. We can't possibly know that. So we don't name for others, especially their experiences, their identities, their struggles. We risk reducing them to a single narrative that may or may not be true to their full humanity. This kind of labeling doesn't create freedom. Instead, it keeps cycles of harm intact. It reinforces stereotypes and can distort someone's true self, their true self. So, this is why naming must always be approached with humility, with compassion, and curiosity. And really, we need to be just naming for ourselves. And rather than using naming as a tool to define others, it should be a process that first helps us understand and process our own experiences. True healing and change come when we start from a place of empathy, acknowledging the shared reality of our human experience. Only then can the act of naming bring clarity, ownership, responsibility, and ultimately freedom. And that's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. I cannot wait for the next ones to come out. I probably will take a little bit of a hiatus over the holidays, but you never know. Maybe there's a little special holiday thing coming out. I don't know yet. We'll find out. But that's all for now. So until next time, peace and joy.